morning. My name is Liz Eberline, and I am the Education Programs Manager at the National Women's History Museum. Today, the National Women's History Museum celebrates the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. This panel will kick off a full day of online programs in celebration of this momentous occasion in the women's equal rights movement. Together with this morning's panel discussion, we will also host an additional virtual Determined to Rise Women's Historical Activism for Equal Rights conversation on a different topic related to the women's suffrage campaign at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. There will also be 3 film screenings: Finding Justice, a film about the 2,000-pound bronze replica of the Liberty Bell that suffragists used as a call to action in their fight for the vote, and 2 short films about suffragist and women's rights advocate Inez Milholland. The day will end with Women Take the Stage, a free virtual concert and rally to increase votes by and for women in the November election. If you are interested in attending these virtual events, please visit womenshistory.org/August-26 for more information. The programs are free, but you must register to attend. In addition to today's celebration, the National Women's History Museum is launching Women Vote, Women Win, a new nonpartisan initiative designed to honor the legacy of the suffragists and all of the women who have worked to secure voting rights for women. Running through the end of 2020, the initiative will explore the historical context of the 19th Amendment, the critical work that continued after its passage to ensure all women had the right to vote, and contemporary issues around voting through programming, partnerships, resources, conversations, and voter engagement activities. While we are disappointed that we can't bring this panel to you in person, we are excited to partner with Michigan Women Forward, the only public statewide foundation devoted to the economic and personal well-being of Michigan women and girls, to reimagine this important discussion on how the West came first in informing women's suffrage debates at the turn of the century as a virtual event. I'd like now to introduce Carolyn Casson, President and CEO of Michigan Women Forward.
Thank you so much, Liz. Michigan Women Forward is very proud to be hosting this panel today, and most importantly, celebrating the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage in the United States. Michigan Women Forward is an organization that actually was created in the 1980s to address gender inequalities. And in fact, its very diverse group of founders identified that here in Michigan, philanthropic dollars were not being directed towards helping women. And with their own personal finances, they set out to change that fact. Here we are 30 years later, and issues here in Michigan that matter to women do receive funding. They are in large part because Michigan Women Forward exists. But we are not ready to declare victory because stark and breathtaking inequalities still exist here in Michigan for women. And MWF's work centers around those. The work still to be done in 4 areas. Young women who we nurture and champion to be sure that they have opportunities to lead. We provide access to lending capital to women entrepreneurs who want to create economic security for themselves, their families, and their businesses. We tackle important issues that disproportionately affect women, like our Rape Kit initiative. And finally, Michigan Women Forward celebrates the incredible and courageous women who came before us, and we honor them through our Women's Museum and Michigan Women's Hall of Fame. Thank you for allowing us to be a part of this event. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's panel, Valerie Marvin, who is the historian and curator of the Michigan State Capitol here in Lansing, which in Michigan, we believe, is the most beautiful and inspiring state capitol in the United States. Valerie makes sure that that legacy is maintained in her role, and we feel privileged to have her here. Valerie?
Thank you so much, Carolyn. It's such a pleasure to be able to be a part of this group celebrating this very special day. Thank you to our panelists, thank you to Michigan Women Forward, and thank you to the National Women's Museum for bringing this event together. I must admit I'm a little sad we're not actually in Michigan celebrating together as we'd originally hoped back in March, but it's still wonderful to be able to gather today of all days to celebrate the accomplishments of women in the suffrage movement. Before we get started with the actual panel discussion, I do want to briefly introduce our panelists. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Lori Ann Lallam, a professor of history at Minnesota State University in Mankato. She teaches courses on the American West, Minnesota history, Western women's history, and gender history. She is currently working on an exhibit titled She Voted with the Minnesota Historical Society, and she co-edited Equality at the Ballot Box, Votes for Women on the Northern Great Plains with her colleague and another panelist with us today, Molly Rosem. So let's introduce Molly next. Dr. Molly Rosem is a professor of history at the University of South Dakota. Her teaching and research interests include the histories of South Dakota, the Great Plains, the American West, the US-Canadian borderlands, gender, and U.S. women's history. In addition to the book I previously mentioned that she co-edited with Lori, she is also the author of Grasslands Grown, Sense of Place and Regional Identity on North America's Canadian Prairies and American Plains. Our third panelist today is Dr. Virginia Pagolini Caruso, a retired professor who taught history in Michigan at Gogebic Community College, Nazareth College, and Henry Ford Community College. Her dissertation, A History of Women's Suffrage in Michigan, chronicles the movement here in the Peninsular State, where our panel was, as I said, originally scheduled to take place. She continues to do research on and speak regarding women's suffrage, and today she is a very active board member of the Historical Society of Michigan. So thank you so much, ladies, for being with us today. Also, just as a quick housekeeping note, for anyone who would like to ask questions of our panelists today, we will be using the chat function. So let's go ahead and move forward. Today, of course, we are here to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which grants women the right to vote in the United States. And the simple narrative of this women's suffrage movement ends there. But the truth is, there is no simple narrative to the women's suffrage movement in America. In fact, we could celebrate, and in some states have been celebrating, significant anniversaries for several years, because in many Western and Midwestern states and territories, we were voting long before that amendment was ratified. And for me personally, as someone who loves to visit capitals, tours capitals as I travel across the country, this came home in a very personal way for me about a year ago when I was traveling out west with my husband. We made it a priority to stop in Wyoming and see the newly restored state capitol there. And as I was in one of the spaces that was originally used as the home of the territorial House legislative body, I suddenly realized that it was in that room, that very place where I was standing, where women's suffrage was first the law of the land in America. And I simultaneously got chills and started to tear up, because as much as I've lived in Michigan my entire life, as a woman who works in state government, as a woman who is under the Capitol's dome every day, that moment in Wyoming history changed my life and the lives of untold women across this country. So I wanted to start today's discussion with that. Lori, tell us why suffrage happened in Wyoming. They were the first state, the first territory to adopt women's suffrage, then the first state. And there was, of course, question about whether or not they would even be able to come into the US because of the fact that their constitution included it. And also, were there others competing for that honor?
Well, thank you, Valerie. Yeah, I think a lot of people realize that Wyoming was the first territory and the first state that enacted full suffrage rights for women. School suffrage did exist in some other places at the time, but full suffrage rights came in Wyoming. And the story is perhaps a little more complicated than we can deal with in this short period of time, this is a story that has been written about for a long period of time because it was an important milestone, and the narrative as to why Wyoming has changed over time. And I'm just going to point to some of the more recent work being done by Jennifer Helton, who intriguingly situates what's happening in Wyoming within the larger context of Reconstruction. And I think it's really important to highlight this connection between African-American voting rights and women's suffrage, because they were clearly linked in the minds of many people in the 1860s when this is happening. Wyoming, of course, enacted women's suffrage in December of 1869. It was a newly created territory. It met to create the Constitution. And ironically, it was a Democrat, not a Republican, who introduced the suffrage bill in Wyoming. Typically, these men, and we have to remember that they are men who are creating the legislation, had often been Republicans and had often been associated with the radical Republican faction of the Republican Party. And these were men who supported voting rights for African-American men, and many of them supported voting rights for women too. And there's this interesting nexus then that takes place in Wyoming. The governor was a radical Republican. The Democrat who introduced the bill was from Virginia, but his wife was a suffragist. And Wyoming then became the first. Because of time limitations, I will briefly say that there had been other efforts in the 1850s, for example, and then again in 1867, Kansas. When Kansas became a territory, there was an effort, and then there was an effort in 1867. And then from my perspective, and in part I'm a native of North Dakota, more importantly is what happened in Dakota Territory in the 1868-1869 legislature, when Dakota Territory almost became the first. Unfortunately, it failed, but there was a brief moment of hope. After, and this is kind of an important story too, after Wyoming enacted women's suffrage, there was pushback. There were efforts in Wyoming to repeal women's suffrage, and during the constitutional conventions for statehood in 1869, there again were some people who said, Wyoming won't become a state if women's suffrage is part of the Constitution. But there had been by that time already 20 years of women's suffrage, and it wasn't going to go away. And so when Wyoming became a state in 1890, it became the first state with women's suffrage. I'll add just one thing in closing, that it's important to remember that it was a lot easier to enact women's suffrage in a territory than in a state. And this was something that when Molly and I were working on equality at the ballot box, just became very clear to us. And it's something that's often not really discussed by scholars, perhaps in the way it should be.
Thank you very much. So Molly, I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit more about the broader context for this movement, because as Lori said, you're also talking about African-American voting rights at the same time. Some people are looking for voting rights across the board for men and women. Others say, no, let African-American men come in first. There's also discussions happening in the West. And keep in mind, when I say West, I'm talking the 19th century version of the West. So that includes today's Midwest. There's also discussion about voting rights for Native Americans, Indigenous people, and also immigrants. And this becomes a real flashpoint in some parts of the country. Can you give us more context for the broad array of voting rights and restrictions that were in place in the post-Civil War period? And how did they affect women's suffrage?
Yes, I can give you some information on that. In particular, there's two complex stories that come to mind in the South Dakota movement. One is the 1890 election in which the electorate voted on women's suffrage. And the second one is the sixth time the state voted on a referendum and was successful, and that's in 1918. So in 1890, there was the first post-statehood referendum in South Dakota. And basically, the electorate was voting on whether or not they should strike the word male from the new state constitution. And this seems straightforward enough. And women worked very, very hard to make this happen, just like they had worked very hard to ensure that the state's constitution did not include the word male. They failed there, and once again, they failed in 1890. Only 33% of the state's voters voted to enact women's suffrage, and it's the worst defeat they have in all 6 referendums. Now, interestingly enough, there's a second measure on the ballot in 1890, and this involves Indian suffrage. That's what they called it at the time, Indian suffrage. And it's a long and complicated story, but basically South Dakota had said nothing about whether the many Indians in its state could vote in elections. South Dakota, the whole western part of the state on the eve of statehood, was the Great Sioux Reservation. And many legislators thought, that's a mistake. We should have put some limitations in the Constitution and restrict Native voting. And so the second referendum that was voted on did just that. It came up with provisions to restrict Native voting. Now, it too failed. By that I mean that the state's electorate failed to restrict Indian voting. So suffragists themselves were very frustrated and angry about this, because to them it seemed as if the male voters in their state were willing to enact suffrage for natives, but not for women. Now, of course, in the end, there were other ways that the state took away the vote for Native Americans. But the reason why I like this story, and they don't necessarily have to be put together, but the suffragists themselves did put them together, it suggests that our racial climate in the post-Civil War years, in the years when the southern states are passing Jim Crow laws, segregation laws, that these were concerns to the West too. When the South Dakota legislature debated these things, they wondered, because of the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment barring discrimination vote, can we limit the Native American vote? So that's one sort of story, I think, that shows how the West can complicate our larger story by bringing in Native Americans. Now, the woman that we started out looking at, was an image of Jane Waldron, and she was a Native American woman, part Dakota heritage, who was a suffragist. So she was actually working for women's suffrage at about this same time. So it's a very complex story. So the second story I want to tell is about the 1918 suffrage referendum, quite a few years later. And it shows tensions over the ethnic immigrant population in the state. In addition to suffragists being upset at the seeming support of their male voters in South Dakota, their support for Native Americans, they also, from very early on, were suspicious of the state's high immigrant population, Germans, Czechs, particularly Germans. And so they had always thought these immigrant communities were a drag on their victories, that cost them their victories. They were sure of it. So what happened in 1918 is very interesting. Of course, 1918, we're in a World War I context, and there's a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment growing, and what this results in South Dakota is a unique woman suffrage amendment. The suffragists had already convinced the legislature to put women's suffrage on the ballot again. Now, in wartime situation, the governor decided to change it and to add a special clause that would address immigrant voting. Now, what you need to understand is that South Dakota at the time is one of 6 states that allows non-citizen immigrants to vote. Now they would have had to have filled out what were called first papers declaring their official intention to become citizens, but they did not yet have to fulfill or completely naturalize. So what this did was combine two issues, the vote for women's suffrage, or at the same time to take away suffrage of alien voters, making the situation be in the state that you had to be a citizen to vote. So in some ways, that's a trajectory the nation is moving toward, with the idea that citizenship should be attached to voting, away from older ideas like gender or race or property, right? So they're heading with that trajectory. But what this did was make it almost impossible for people who are opposed to women's suffrage to vote against it, because they could not vote against women's suffrage without voting for non-citizen immigrant voting. And so that basically took away all the oppositions. And let me just kind of close this out, because people wonder, well, is really anti-immigrant sentiment that bad or that prevalent? Well, and it was. And one of the posters that was prevalent at the time was called "Why Should I Vote for Amendment E?" which is how the amendment came across to the people. Because the vote of the alien is a menace in time of war. Because this is the opportunity for voters of South Dakota to Americanize their state. There's several reasons because, and they all kind of hint at this underlying hostility towards non-citizen immigrants voting. So in the end, this helped suffragists in South Dakota to win the vote. And so by way of concluding here, all of these complicated stories in some way involve tensions over new immigrants, over race, over the idea of Native Americans still living within the different states. So I think bringing in the West in particular helps us see this complicated suffrage story and shows the racial tensions and the ethnic tensions in the West. It wasn't just in the South. And so I'll stop by there.
Well, I think your point is really interesting, Molly, because in some ways what you're saying is that people in different parts of the country often saw suffrage as almost a zero-sum game. In order for women to achieve the right to vote, in some cases, other people had to lose the right to vote. And I think it speaks to how tenuous a lot of people felt these rights were. And that's something that I know is easy for me to forget, is that when we tell the story of voting in America, we like to see it as this forward march of progress, where people are always coming under the tent together. The voting public is getting bigger and bigger and more inclusive. And the truth of the matter is, that's not accurate. Just as people have achieved the right to vote, people have lost the right to vote in this country. And it's often a very brutal balancing act for us to sort out what this all means. And it's not always simply a matter of race or of ethnicity. There was also, I think, a zero-sum sense among some when it came to business. You can't separate the discussion around women's suffrage also from temperance or from prohibition, as we tend to think of it in the 20th century. Virginia, I know your writing deals with this. Prohibition, meaning the attempt to restrict or even prohibit the sale and consumption of alcohol in America, played a huge role in the suffrage movement. It brought some women into suffrage. It turned some people off to suffrage, including a lot of business owners. And this was a real battleground. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and how it was specifically seen in Michigan in the early 20th century?
Liquor and suffrage in Michigan is very complex. In the 50s, when we have the state constitutional revision of 1850, women's suffrage doesn't exist. There are no petitions about it. There are lots of petitions about liquor, and there are multiple positions on liquor. but there's nothing about women's suffrage. There are petitions for colored suffrage, because the Michigan Constitution of 1835 and the Constitution of 1850 will initially read white male. In the 1867 Constitution, which does not pass the voters, there are debates about colored suffrage, there are debates about women's suffrage, and the biggest single fight in the whole thing is, again, what do we do about liquor? And here, the biggest chunk of petitions you get are about the liquor issue. What I did do in the dissertation was look at the counties which petitioned for women's suffrage, and about half of the counties had petitions for women's suffrage from those counties, and what kind of petitioning about liquor was in those same counties. And the interesting thing was that the largest single chunk of petitions from the women's suffrage counties was what was known as no license. What that means is the state of Michigan is being encouraged to take absolutely no position on alcohol. No regulation. License would require regulation about hours, quality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to be moral. Nothing about liquor. And that's where, and the petitions come about half and half for men and women in this no license category. By the 1880s, both the anti-liquor movement and the women's movement are getting a little more political. And what it shows up most clearly is the anti-liquor interests start pushing for what's called local option. They're going to advocate that each county in Michigan, and we've got 83 of them by that point, can vote itself dry or prohibitionist. And what we start seeing are petitions coming from locals of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. In 1883, all the petitions for municipal suffrage, for the right to vote in local elections, come from the Women's Christian Temperance Union locals. In 1884, the Michigan Equal Suffrage Association will form, and you'll begin to see occasionally a petition from one of their affiliates for municipal suffrage. But the bulk of the petitions, and there'll be as much as 150 of them in a year, will still come from the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And they want to vote in municipal elections so they can vote on county local option and they can vote dry. In 1893, Michigan will pass a municipal suffrage bill. It'll be thrown out by the state legislature, by the state Supreme Court, which rules that the clause in the Constitution that specifies male elector dominates. And so the municipal suffrage project disappears. I looked at the patterns for voting in the legislature, and the dries, the folks who are prohibitionist, tend to support women's suffrage, but it's not a one-to-one relationship in any way, shape, or form. In 1907, Michigan finally gets around to seriously revising the Constitution of 1850. Again, lots of petitions about liquor, again, all over the map about liquor. The women's suffrage petitions, not as many, but at least one of them comes with 5,000 signatures, which is an awful lot of signatures together. There's a prohibition amendment proposed, it fails. There's a women's suffrage amendment proposed, it fails. Men in the Constitutional Convention, again, the dry vote tends to be folks who also support women's suffrage. The referenda of 1912, we have 20-some counties that go for a local option. And so I can look at how voters behaved in 1912. And the pattern there is that male voters who supported going dry in their county tend to be the counties that supported women's suffrage. The thing is decoupled, for lack of a better word, in 1916, because the Anti-Saloon League gets a Prohibition amendment ratified by a statewide referendum, and in January of 1917, Michigan officially goes dry. Those of us who live on the east side of the state, Michigan, know Michigan may have officially gone dry, but the stuff is coming in from Canada every blasted day. But officially we're dry. In 1918, the Michigan Equal Suffrage Association has pushed through the 1917 state legislature a proposal to amend the Constitution so that we have full women's suffrage, and that passes. And what I did in my dissertation is I looked at the votes for Prohibition in 1916 and the votes for women's suffrage in 1918, and I took all 83 of my counties and I did a scatter diagram. And 81 of those 83 counties, the vote for Prohibition increases, the vote for women's suffrage increases. Two oddities. One of them I can fully explain, and the other one I'm not sure what's going on. Ottawa County, I can explain. The Reformed Church is extremely strong in Ottawa County, and they have a very traditional view of the family, and it's a very patriarchal family. Women are wives and mothers and shut up, to put it crudely. And the one minister of the Reformed tradition who comes out for women's suffrage in 1913 will actually be tried for heresy by his congregation and will be shot by a member of his church. That's how fiercely that community feels about no woman suffrage. The other county is in the Upper Peninsula, and all I can think of is that the lumberjacks in that county wanted to keep their bars open and they didn't care whether women voted or not. I can't prove that hypothesis, but that's my suspicion. So there's a lot of tangle going on here. Michigan at that time, in 1893, when it passes municipal suffrage, is also the year that the legislature proposes an amendment to the Constitution that ends alien suffrage. And I think the reason that what triggers it is there are contested elections in both the House and the Senate in 1893, and they have to hire translators when they're interviewing the disputed voters.
Oh, interesting. Thanks, Virginia. You know, this all, again, just speaks to how very complicated this process was. And one of the big complications for women before we had the vote was in knowing how we could voice our political opinions. Now, as you said, traditionally, in many communities, it was always the role of the family patriarch to speak on behalf of those in his household, be it his wife, his children, his sister, his elderly mother, whoever was living there with him. And in some ways, this is the idea of coverture in action. You know, the wife is covered by her husband. They are literally one together. But there were women who stepped outside of normal boundaries. There were women who had a public profile, who had built up a platform of sorts, particularly in the post-Civil War period, and they used that to speak out. And for me, when I think of these women, I always think of Sojourner Truth, who of course ends up living in Michigan in the post-Civil War period. She is well known at this point in time, both as an abolitionist, but also for her support for women's rights. But interestingly, she comes to our current capital which opens in 1879, 2 years later in 1881. And when she comes, she doesn't talk about Jim Crow and Reconstruction. She doesn't talk about women's suffrage. She comes and tells the legislature that she is horrified that they are considering getting rid of Michigan's ban on capital punishment. Now, for those of you not from Michigan, just a quick history lesson here. Michigan's government was the first in the English-speaking world to outlaw capital punishment. And this was a big part of our identity in reform communities from very early on. And Truth told them that night that she believed God had spared her life so she could come and speak truth to them. And ultimately, she was successful in that the ban was not abolished. Molly, I know your research has dealt with some of the other legal matters as well. Tell us more about what was important to women. What were they speaking out on in this era? And how were these things combined or not with the suffrage movement?
Yeah, I think this is a really good topic because, of course, even going back to the Declaration of Sentiments, women were asking for the vote, but for many, many things, right? So in South Dakota, here's just a sampling of a few laws that were changed or that they were trying to change. One important law was the age of protection or consent for women. Really, by the work of a lot of WCTU suffragists, South Dakota changed it from the age of 10 to 14 in 1887, and then tried to change it further in 1893 to 18 years, but they compromised and changed the age of consent to 16 years, and they revised rape laws at the time and punishments. That's one area that I think was pretty standard across the United States that women cared about. The other one is equal pay. Very early on, women asked for equal pay for equal work. And I can tell you that at the turn of the century, while women had about 3 times the number of teaching jobs, they were paid 85% of what male teachers made in the state. And so this was something that even some of the suffragists in 1918 were asking for. Of course, we're still asking for equal pay, I think, today. In the late 19th century, early 20th century, a married woman in South Dakota could not own her own earnings if she lived within the household of her husband. If she did not live in the household, she did have the right to her earnings. And then a final example would be jury duty. And in some cases, this was something anti-suffragists tried to scare suffragists with and said, if you win the vote, you'll have to also perform duties like serve on juries, which many women, of course, wanted to be part of the jury of their peers, right? And one woman, Gladys Pyle, who was actually Mamie Pyle's daughter. Now, Mamie Pyle was the president of the South Dakota Universal Franchise League. So her daughter became the first woman to serve in South Dakota's legislature in 1922, so right after the vote. And one of the things she tried to get passed was women's jury duty service, and that she failed in that. And it's not until 1947 that South Dakota actually allows women to serve on juries. And to come full circle, Gladys Pyle is actually the first woman jury foreman in 1947, when the first jury on which women were permitted to serve. So, but that's a range of, a lot of rights, intersected with this idea for the vote. They thought the vote could help them more easily win some of these rights, but they were always advocating for a variety of things.
As you're mentioning these different women, it reminds us of the fact that so often when we talk about the suffrage movement with the national narrative, we talk about the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 when the Declaration of Women's Sentiments is adopted. We talk about people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, but in so many cases, while they were incredibly important national figures, it's the women on the ground, literally the laced up boots on the ground, if you will, who are making these changes happen. These are the women who are stuffing envelopes, who are trying to strike good printing deals for flyers. They're the women driving the horses that are pulling suffrage floats and parades. I know we could probably spend the rest of the day talking about this, but I would love to hear each one of you tell me briefly, what role do you think these women on the ground played? You know, what was their impact?
I mean, there's so many of them. You're right. It's hard to, you know, select just one or two to talk about. But they were, you know, they were the workhorses on the ground, and they went, you know, door to door, and they went to the state fairs and the you know, harvest festivals, and to the local community venues, and we're always talking about suffrage, always distributing literature. A couple of interesting ones for me, Etta Esty Boyce was a suffragist in Sioux Falls who was a tenor singer, and so she taught singing lessons, and she helped lobby the state legislature to get some of the referendums passed. And when they did one year, she gave a performance, a solo performance, you know, to the men, and in celebration of it. And she also was a good fundraiser for it. But she did, you know, so she did that amidst her voice work. We had a couple of outside suffragists come into the state. Liba Peshakova, who was a Catholic Bohemian, who spoke to our Czech immigrant audiences, and Ida Stady from New York, who was on the ground speaking to those German audiences, trying to get them to support suffrage. Many women on the ground were teachers, and they would go among their students and go further and run for office as teachers, and then also pursue suffrage promotion.
Virginia, what about you?
My favorite is Rhoda, and I only know her as Rhoda. She shows up in the 1874 Paw Paw Register, writing about one day campaigning for women's suffrage. Since I've been one of those people who's been out there handing out literature at county fairs and at community events, I know how long her day was, because boy, those days go on forever. But here's her day. Rhoda gets up at 4 a.m. and goes to Decatur. So she lives outside Decatur someplace. She goes to Decatur so she can catch the 6 a.m. milk train, so it can take her to her first suffrage meeting. She does 3 suffrage meetings over the course of the day. She describes herself as having good meetings and good food. She admits she caused somebody to cry and then owns up it was a baby. And she gets home late. And she says she values working for women's suffrage. She thinks women's suffrage is very important, but boy, she's getting tired. And she's one of hundreds of women in 1874, in 1912, in 1913, in 1918 in Michigan, and in other places, who put in days like that where you get up at ungodly early hours and you come home at ungodly late hours, and all you've done all day is talk to people about the issue you're pushing. The other one I'd like to talk about is Mary L. Doe, who is never an officer of the Michigan Equal Suffrage Association, but for 30 years, the woman is active in the group. She works very hard to build links between the middle class and upper middle class women in the Michigan Equal Suffrage Association and working class women and working class men. On several occasions, she makes sure that striking workers come to the Michigan Equal Suffrage Association annual meeting and talk about what their workloads look like, what their wages look like, what their working conditions look like, to make them aware of why the laundry workers are striking, why the coal miners are striking, those kind of things. And she does this for 30 years. She dies practically in harness. She works in the Detroit office of the Equal Suffrage Association for the 1913 referendum in Detroit, goes home to stay with a friend that night and is dead 2 years later. She's 2 days later. She's basically worked herself into a hole and died of exhaustion for all practical purposes. Her death certificate doesn't give us a clue why. It just says dead. But without them, Anthony and Stanton and the other leaders are talking to the wind. Nobody's going to hear them. Nobody's going to notice. Mm-hmm. It's only when you got the army on the ground behind you that you're a real leader. And it's people like Rhoda and Mary Eldo and hundreds others that make the difference.
Lori, who have you found as you've been researching and writing?
Well, I'm going to approach this a little more broadly. So broadly, a lot of women went unrecognized who worked, as you said, as everyone has said, for the cause of suffrage. This is one of my favorite photographs. It does come from North Dakota. Again, I'm a little biased. I'm from North Dakota. But this is a women's rest tent at the 1914 Bottineau County Fair in North Dakota. And Bottineau County is up by the Canadian border. And this was a joint effort of the Votes for Women League and the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And one of the things that is consistent throughout much of the United States is this linkage between the WCTU and women's suffrage groups. And this becomes problematic, particularly after the national organization wants to divest the suffrage cause from this prohibition, from prohibition, because they see it as an undue weight. And yet a lot of these women who were actively engaged, particularly in these Western states, supported women's suffrage and they supported the WCTU. And they trained in the WCTU. They went out, they learned how to speak, and many of them became leaders in the organization of their state, but also of their local communities. And this is an example. There are so many unnamed suffragists. None of the women in this image are named. It was donated to the State Historical Society of North Dakota, but we don't know who these women and children are. The other thing that I would like to point out is that the Library of Congress's Chronicling America has turned out to be a boon for historians of all topics related particularly to the 19th and early 20th century, but especially for suffrage scholars, because some of these women become visible in the newspaper in ways that they are not visible in the collections that historians access in archives. And a case in point is Virginia Bilodeau, a Blackfeet woman from Montana. And this is the only evidence we have, this newspaper article that appeared in the suffrage issue, the September 1914 State Fair suffrage issue in Montana, that references Bilodeau and the fact that she is, and other Blackfeet women, are supporters of women's suffrage. And so I think these kinds of unnamed women, and she came to the State Fair. We don't know for sure if she marched in the parade, but it would seem to imply that she did. Women crisscrossed states and territories, initially in trains, as Virginia mentioned, but then also in Model Ts. And they gave speeches from the Model Ts on street corners, and mothers and daughters sometimes traveled together to give speeches, and they covered a lot of territory. And, you know, the sad reality is that in many instances, the bill or the amendment went down to defeat, and then they were added again and again. And in the case of South Dakota, again and again. But I'm really intrigued by some of these women of whom we do not know very much.
So going back to your pride in North Dakota, Lori,
Yeah.
with these, particularly with the later generation of suffrage supporters, one advantage that they have over the women who came before them is they have in large part been able to get a better education. And for me, this is another point of pride that I feel in the Midwest, is that in addition to leading on suffrage, we were also leading on co-education specifically. The idea that men and women could and should go to school together and have access to the same kinds of education. We're starting to run a little short on time here, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the ties between suffrage and co-education in the Midwest and the West specifically.
Yeah, and I will do that very briefly since we are running short on time. So co-education plays an important role in women's suffrage. Of course, it's not universal. Just because you have a co-educational experience does not mean that you're a suffragist. But when we look at, particularly in some of the Midwestern states and Western states, many of the women and some of the men who were engaged in the suffrage movement did have this co-educational experience. And I'll just mention a couple of people. This is Cora Smith Eaton, whose image is in the background. And she was part of the first graduating class of the University of North Dakota, which was a co-educational institution. And she played an important role in women's suffrage in North Dakota, Minnesota, Washington State. She was also engaged in the California campaign too. But these experiences at these co-educational institutions prepared women in a way to compete with men, to engage with men in an atmosphere of intellectual exchange. Often suffrage organizations existed at these co-educational institutions. At the University of North Dakota, a little bit later, President Merrifield and his wife hosted suffrage events on campus. They were both suffragists. Hamlin University, a private institution that was co-ed quite early on, produced a number of important suffragists in the state of Minnesota, but also throughout the West. And so I think there really is something to this connection between coeducation and women's suffrage. And keep in mind that a number of the early large coeducational universities were in the Midwest and the West. Thinking in terms, since I'm in Minnesota, the University of Minnesota, which had an extremely active women's suffrage organization.
Well, and in Michigan here, you can tie even the early suffrage movement. Virginia mentioned earlier the push in the early 1870s. You know, the Stone family was very prominent in that. And the Stones were also educators and are given credit really with helping push the regents at the University of Michigan to the point where they opened the doors to women. So it's fascinating to look at all of these different ties. You know, I've really enjoyed our conversation today. I think we could keep talking about this for the next 3 hours without any trouble at all. But I'm just curious to know something I'd like to ask everybody to answer quickly. If you could write one piece of the story back into the bigger narrative that we do teach, even in middle school and high school, what would it be for you? Lori, do you want to jump in?
Certainly, I would like to recenter the narrative away from the East. Still today, the dominant narrative starts with Seneca Falls, and I guess I'm actually in some ways okay with that, even though there are earlier efforts. But it's still this very Eastern-centric narrative. And yet the successes come in the West and the successes come in the Midwest. And I think we should focus more on some of those successes and try to frame it around what is happening here that makes this region support women's suffrage instead of kind of focusing on all the failures in the East. And I will stop there.
That's a great point. Virginia, how about you?
I think recentering it to look more at the places where it succeeds and taking some of the emphasis off Stanton and Anthony and Stone would give us a much more realistic picture of what's actually going on with the women's suffrage movement, because the women on the ground in the Western states and the Midwest states are not politically stupid after they've been out looking for a couple of years. They figured out how to make the system work for them. They simply have to figure out how to persuade enough men to cooperate. And that's a very different thing from the narrative if you focus on Stanton and Anthony and Stone. So I think Laura's quite right about decentering the national leadership is part of what we should all be working on.
Molly, how about you?
Well, I too was going to bring up the fact that we need to center more on the West and its contributions to the national story, but I would carry that forward because with a particular focus on land and colonization, linking it up to the US's own policy of colonizing the West, and then it brings in a Native American negotiation phase. Women could claim land as homesteaders in the West. This allowed them to argue their property owners, something very classic in terms of the way people in the United States originally were given the vote. And I think if we look through a Western lens, we see a very complicated political system that makes the Western colonization central really to the story of the nation at this time, but it contributes a lot towards women's suffrage. Not to mention that all the new Western states coming in, they are debating new constitutions where they are actively making these decisions about who's going to vote. It's not a project of revising old constitutions. Mm-hmm. They're creating them at the same time women are in earnest arguing for suffrage. So I think that makes a difference. I think constitution making, land ownership, and colonization with all its positives and negatives for the race relations in the United States. I think all of that would help us see new things in the East and understand the fuller story better.
Well, and I'm reminded too of how at the very beginning, we were talking about the fact that as we celebrate today, we're also thinking about what suffrage allowed women to do going forward. And for me, that's a critical part of our story here in the Michigan State Capitol building, because sure, women came to this building, they lobbied hard for suffrage, and they were playing a lot of other roles in government before they got the right to vote. But to me, the real fruition of the suffrage movement is when you start seeing women elected. In 1919, we elect our first statewide female office holder, Doris Stockman, who's elected to the State Board of Agriculture. So again, tying in with that idea of land and production. In 1920, we elect Eva McCall Hamilton. Now, we didn't talk a lot about health today, but this was, of course, something that was very important to a lot of suffrage reformers. And Eva actually stands up and gives her very first speech in the Senate floor of March, on the Senate floor of March of 1921. And she talks about a health-related matter. And the newspaper descriptions tell us that there were women in the gallery. And for me, I have to think that that was such a powerful moment, because for the first time, a woman was actually speaking with the voice of a lawmaker. That had never happened before in this building. And it's a reminder that, you know, we still see the outgrowth of suffrage today. You know, yes, we're celebrating the fact that this happened 100 years ago, but we still live in the world that this helped create. And in an election year, we're talking about who's running for office and what their platforms are. And it's a reminder that history is living and breathing. History creates the world that we live in today. So I want to thank you all so much for joining us today. I think this has really put a wonderful context around the suffrage movement. And quite frankly, it's made me all more proud to be from the Midwest. So thank you so much, Molly and Virginia and Lori. And I also, again, really want to thank Michigan Women Forward for their sponsorship of today's event, and the National Women's History Museum for putting it together. Thank you so much, and happy Women's Equality Day.